Assalamu'alaikum Warahmatullahi Wabarakatuh. Today we want to explain about verbal communication. We are from group 4. Our group members were Agnes Bellinda, Calista Adelia Ramadhani, Fauziah Febrianti, and me, Pramaditya Ridho. Next slide, please. The first material will be delivered by Agnes Bellinda. For the time, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pramaditya, for letting me start the presentation. So, the first material is we are going to talk about verbal communication. Dramatic language and ordinary language. There are the overlapping of two levels. Dramatic speech and ordinary speech are intimately bound up atau terikat erat with the immediate context or situation that the participant in the dialogues find themselves in, but dramatic speech is nonetheless semantically much more complex than the ordinary speech. So it is because there is another factor, it is the audience. This means that to all the direct participants of the dialogue is added to another participant. Silent but important, for everything which is said in dramatic dialogue is oriented towards him, toward affecting his consciousness. And the dramatic speech doesn't have only to address, it has two expressive subject. One is fictional expressive, and then the other is expressive subject. Kalau yang expressive subject itu tergambarkan menjadi dramatic figure di dalam dramatic speech tersebut, sedangkan kalau yang expressive subject satunya lagi itu adalah si autornya. Oke, yang selanjutnya, dimension of deviation. Dramatic speech also deviates from ordinary speech in its employment of an aesthetically functionalized language. Its deviatory character is revealed in the way it violates the norm of the linguistic primary codes. By the use of innovative words, formation, or archaism, for example, and in the introduction of other structural features, such as rhetorical stylization of matter. And then, not only the use of matter, this distance can be reduced to the point of assimilation also. And dramatic speech is thus always located in the area of tension that occurs between at least two dimensions of deviation, as a result of which a reduction of the level of deviation from ordinary language is often in inverse proportion to the level of deviation from the established convention of dramatic language and vice versa. Okay, we move to the next point. There is the polyfunctionality of dramatic language. The first one is polyfunctionality. Dramatic utterance always fulfills several functions in the internal communication system simultaneously, though one of these may dominate over the others. Jadi sebuah tuturan dramatis itu selalu memenuhi beberapa fungsi dalam sistem komunikasi internal secara bersamaan. Namun, hal ini dapat ada hanya satu yang lebih dominan di antara yang lainnya. Oke, kita bisa lihat dari contohnya di PowerPoint. Ada dalam contohnya dialog yang Mary and Carl. Kita akan mengambil contohnya yang baik yang Carl-nya, yang you talk different if you know the way you look. Di sini itu dominan fiturnya adalah appellative function directed at the ditujukan kepada Carl, yaitu the way si Mary ini terlihat. Jadi Carl ini membicarakan tentang si Mary ini bagaimana terlihat. Dalam speech ini, karakter ini tergambarkan dari refleksinya dalam dia menggunakan bahasanya. Yaitu bahasa yang gunakan itu bahasa yang terkesan tidak intelijen atau kalangan bawah. Dapat dilihat dari ya talk dan you menjadi ya, dan yud menjadi yad. Dan kemudian juga di sini menunjukkan bahwa Carl ini ingin merasa lebih unggul dibandingkan Mary, dengan dia merasa lebih unggul dan tidak membutuhkan Mary yang menurutnya tidak menarik. Kemudian bahasa yang digunakan di sini juga yaitu sebagai referential function dari Carl yang menginterpretasikan bahwa hubungannya dengan Mary ini dia berhubungan dengan Mary yang dia anggap tidak menarik. Oke, kemudian yang selanjutnya adalah referential function. The referential function dominates strongly in the conventional forms of dramatic reports, such as the exploratory narrative, the messenger report, and the text copy. These particular elements of the plot are presented in the purely verbal form or technical reason of the narrative, which is for economical or technical reason. Oke, bisa dilihat dari contoh dari PPT tersebut. Pada kasus ini, di sini dominannya kepada referential function ditunjukkan dari si speaker ini, pembicara speech ini, tidak terlalu menunjukkan dirinya di dalam speech tersebut. Dia ini diam di belakang layar dan tidak terlalu sering mengekspresikan dirinya di dalam speech tersebut. Dan juga tidak terlalu memberikan sebuah gambaran untuk menarik dirinya sebagai si speaker ini. Jadi dia ini lebih diam di belakang layar. Oke, bisa dilihat yang tadi disebutkan, poin-poinnya ada appears in this particular scene, have no pretension in direction of rushing interest, dan yang ketiga, scarcely even attempts to present himself in expressive function. Kemudian ada the complete absence of personal pronoun, jadi personal pronounnya tidak terlalu ada. Dan yang terakhir ada does not try to emphasize the appellative function. Oke, yang selanjutnya ada expressive function. The expressive function of an utterance relates back to the speaker of a speech and is always a great importance, especially within the external communication system. So in the expressive function ini kita bisa lihat di contohnya ada dialog antara Franz sama Wassalamu'alaikum. Franz berkata, "Poison, poison, from your wife, I, he rushed off." Kemudian Wassalamu'alaikum, "Mary, go after him, he is desperate." Mary exists, "Poison from my own wife, God, I feel it, martyrdom and death." Jadi di sini itu ada eksklamasi ya. Eksklamasinya itu ada pada yang tanda seru itu merupakan eksklamasi yang digunakan di dalam expressive function ini. Pada dialog dari Franz ini, di sini berfungsi untuk menunjukkan ekspresi hebohnya dari si Franz. Ketika dia mengatakan poison, poison, dia menunjukkan ekspresi heboh. Sedangkan dari dialog Wassalamu'alaikum ini lebih kepada menunjukkan makna bahwa si Wassalamu'alaikum ini sedang bereaksi kepada event yang sedang terjadi dibandingkan dia sedang bereaksi heboh. Dia hanyalah memberikan reaksi terhadap kejadian tersebut. Kemudian selanjutnya ada appellative function. It is true that all these function, it is the appellative function in particular that is dependent on dialogues, and the importance of this function increase in proportion to the degree the dialogue partner is involved. So, the more the speaker tries to influence or change the mind of the dialogue partner, and the more he or she reacts to the latter's reservation and objection, the stronger the appellative function will be. And predominant appellative function is particularly common in dramatic speech and that dialogues in which one partner attempts to persuade or win over the other have been virtually obligatory component. Jadi appellative function ini biasanya umum digunakan dalam dramatic speech yang tujuannya adalah untuk menang dari seseorang lainnya. Okay. Dialogues are often used to mark dramatic climaxes with a high level of suspense. And then the pathic function. The pathic function associated with the channel between speaker and listener. And then designed to create and maintain the contact between speaker and listener. Jadi pathic function ini lebih berfokus kepada menghubungkan antara speaker sama si listener ini. Dan juga bagaimana mereka ini memaintain kontak yang sedang mereka jalani. And then, in the external system by such diverse factors as the spatial layout of stage, auditorium, the title of the use of advertising, the receiver involvement in the play, the use of epic communication structures, and possibilities of identification with one or more of the figures in the text itself. Jadi, pada external system yang ada dalam pathic function ini lebih kepada bagaimana layout dari panggungnya, kemudian bagaimana judul dan iklannya ini bisa mengangkat atau menarik penonton, dan kemudian bagaimana involvement dari partisipan atau penonton yang menonton speech tersebut. Kemudian on the internal level, pada level internalnya, the pathic function helps create and intensify the dialogical contact between the various figure. Jadi kalau tadi itu external systemnya, sedangkan sekarang internal levelnya itu lebih kepada berfungsi kepada bagaimana meng-create atau membuat dialog yang kontaknya di antara semua figur-figur yang ada. And then metalingual function associated with the code and is generally only present in Latin form. And then on the internal dramatic level, the motivation behind such attempts to draw the audience attention to the verbal code. Jadi dalam internal dramatic levelnya, motivasi dari metalingual function ini adalah untuk menarik perhatian audiens kepada verbal code-nya atau kode verbalnya. Contohnya nih yang bisa dilihat dalam PPT tersebut ada percakapan antara seorang gelandangan alkoholik yang bernama Ash dan seorang mantan guru bernama Lodge. Ash berkata, "My wife couldn't have children." So Lodge kemudian bertanya, "What's it to do with her underneath?" Kita akan menggaris bawah di sini underneath. Kemudian kita bisa lihat Ash itu seperti tidak mengerti dengan dia menyatakan bahwa I'm sorry. Dia itu tidak mengerti maksud dari Lodge ini. Kemudian Lodge memahami situasinya bahwa Ash ini tidak memahami maksudnya dia. Kemudian dia mengubahnya menjadi underneath ini menjadi the womb. To do with her womb, was it? Dan kemudian Ash lebih mengerti dari pergantian kata tersebut. Di sini menunjukkan bahwa ada sebuah perubahan kata di mana dalam situasi sosial tertentu kata tersebut mungkin tidak dimengerti oleh beberapa orang atau mungkin tidak appropriate, kemudian bisa diganti menjadi kata yang lebih appropriate dengan menggunakan sebuah pergantian metalingual function. And then the next point is, on the contrary, the predominance of the metalingual function may also be motivated by a high degree of verbal virtuosity or games with the rules of the code, common in comedy. Jadi, selain dari social functions tersebut, bisa juga, biasanya metalingual function ini juga terdapat pada sebuah speech comedy dengan menggunakan permainan kata itu atau kata lainnya puns ya. Dan yang terakhir ada poetic function. The poetic function is manifested in the way a message refers to itself and thus draws the audience attention to its structure and constituent parts. In ordinary speech, normally, the poetic function only applies to the external communication system and not to the communication process. Jadi, poetic function ini itu lebih kepada digunakannya kepada normalnya external communication, sedangkan tidak terlalu pada internal communication. Dan jikalau digunakan pada internal communication, biasanya akan mengundang ketidakpahaman, kesalahpahaman yang akan berujung pada kritik. Kemudian, to achieve poetic function that can be effective in the internal level, it would require explicit or implicit reference to it in the utterance of the dramatic figure. Jadi, untuk menggunakan poetic function ini mungkin tidak terlalu efektif jika digunakan dalam internal, namun bukan berarti tidak bisa. Ini bisa digunakan jikalau harus menggunakan implicit atau explicit references dalam pengucapannya. Okay, the next point is explicit insofar as speaker or listener is described in particular utterance as aesthetically stylistic and poetic. Implicit insofar as the speeches of one particular figure in marked contrast to the others are conspicuous for their high degree of poet stylization. Okay, that's all from me. Maybe the next material will be delivered by my friends. Thank you.
Okay, the next material I want to explain about verbal communication and action. Tindak komunikasi di sini yang dimaksud adalah tindakan seseorang dalam berkomunikasi yang berupa ucapan atau kata-kata. Wujudnya berupa tujuan, uraian, tuturan, dan tutur tindak. Kemudian, di verbal communication ini terbagi menjadi dua. Ada the identity of speech and action. The identity of speech and action. Hubler's definition of action is the transition from one situation to another in the evolutionary sense, conceptually from a number of possibilities according to the nature of the situation, and determined solely by the speech of the characters. Even this type of silent behavior, however, is usually accompanied by verbal behaviors that help when justify or clarify the intent behind nonverbal behaviors. Yang kedua ada the non-identify of speech and action. Di bagian kedua ini terbagi menjadi dua lagi, yaitu speech related to action and speech unrelated to action. Speech related to action, from this it becomes clear that it is not true for all dramatic utterance that the distance between speech and action should be different. The situation will change dramatically, but as he spoke and acted the same, he remained immersed in his situation. And second, speech unrelated to action. When language is contrast with action, it is not synonymous with action, but it remains directly related to action. The latter is based on the axiom that action immediate change dramatic situation are impossible, and thus the whole idea that language can be attributed to higher action is rejected a priori. Next slide, Agnes. The next point, there are restriction in the correspondence between language and dramatic figure. The discuss of the expressive function of language show the importance of language in building the image of dramatic characters. Only through this method, aided by a series of nonverbal self-description tools, can the recipient see them as real people with varying personalities. There are the superimposition of poetic function on the expressive function. The relevance of this linguistic correspondence or linguistic figures has never been flatly rejected, but it is still so narrowly defined in the theoretical history that in practice it must be distinguished entirely expressive function in internal communication system and poetic function in external system. And the second point, the superimposition of effic communication structure on reference. The degree of proximity between the image and the language also depend on the interpretation of the selected imagery. When dramatic characters are allowed to be shown, the high level of conscious and expression of such work therefore resembles a broader aesthetic structure such as poetry and also reflects the interpretation of many others, should not be directly and unconditionally attribute only the characteristic. And the last point is superimposition of reference to the situation on figure reference. Another factors that limited the congruence between speech and personality, that is the ability to decode the temperament of a dramatic character from speech, is that the speech is a dramatic character depends only on temperament, which is also determined by the temperament of the situation. However, we have chosen an example in which stylistic differences are not the result of the character's characteristic, but the direct stress of the situation in which the areas. Next slide, Agnes. And the last material, there are characterization through language. The first, there are explicit self-presentation and implicit self-presentation. The first, explicit self-presentation, occurs when characters actively describe their self-perception. This can be done in the context of a monologue or dialogue. Leaving aside the moon perspective of objective self-expression used in the Middle Ages, sometimes Elizabeth works are customary and thus the information obtained by the recipient from the image must be evaluated as an element of subject color as a form of self-expression. There are also examples of description, and the last material, implicit self-presentation. The situation is different when using implicit, unconscious, or involuntary verbal method to express oneself. The latter aspect concurs, among other things, the linguistic interaction of various characters. The frequent interruption or interruption in the interlocutor's speech indicate implementing or restraint. Frequent use of proverbs or abstract analysis of situation often reflects culturally tendency to devise, and the ability to verbal adapt to the open or situation is also included in various patterns of verbal behavior or archetype. The next material will be presented by my friend Calista. Thank you.
Okay, well, I will take over to explain the next material, which is about monological speech. There are three types of monological speech. The first one is monologue and dialogue. The second one is soliloquy, and the third is asides. Next slide. Okay, before we dive into the material, we must know what is monologue. Okay, a monologue is a type of speech where the person or the characters tries to express his or her feelings through thoughts or ideas through a speech that is usually long. It does not require or involve other characters. In performing arts or drama, the word dialogue means a conversation between two people, and the discussion is intended to sum up an agreement. It could be in a drama. Okay. Now, I will explain about the situational and the structural differentials. Okay, the main difference between monologue and dialogue is that monologue refers to a long or short speech that is delivered by one person or single person, while a dialogue involves a minimum of 2 people. Both monologue and dialogue are two devices of literature that are related to speech. The first one, there is situational creation, which refers to the speaker's solitude. This means that there is no actual address on stage and that the figure is left to talk to himself. The second one is there is the structural criterion, which refers to the length and degree of autonomy of a particular speech. According to the first criterion, then a longest report or a long speech are not monologues since they are addressed directly to other figures on stage. However, according to the second, they are definitely are monologue since they are self-contained, autonomous speech of a reasonable length. The second one is about soliloquy versus monologicity. Okay. Monologue is a lengthy speech presented by a character of a play to other character or audience, while soliloquy is a lengthy speech presented by individual character to him or herself. A monologue could either be addressed to other character or audience, a narration of a story, or even some speech to achieve a certain goal, while a soliloquy is an expression of a character's inner thought. Monologue is often aimed to be listened, while a soliloquy is not. A soliloquy is a type of monologue. Okay. Reviewing this description and difference, one could understand that both monologue and soliloquies share a similarity in terms of the speakers being an individual giving a lengthy speech, but differ in terms of the listener. A monologue could be aimed at some audience, while a soliloquy is not intended to be heard by other characters of the drama. This would be the most suitable difference between a monologue and soliloquy. Okay, the next about dialogue versus dialogicity. Dialogue is antonym of soliloquy. Okay, the difference between dialogue and soliloquy is that dialogue is a conversation or other form of discourse between two or more individuals, while soliloquy is a drama or the act of a character speaking to themselves. So, as individuals, so as to reveal their thoughts to the audience, and the others of the difference between dialogue and soliloquy is that dialogue. Okay. So the other of the difference between dialogue and soliloquy is that dialogue is informal, to discuss or negotiate so that all parties can reach an understanding, while soliloquy is very rare to issue a soliloquy. Okay, the third one about monological tendencies in dialogue. From this is possible to define an ideal form of dialogical dialogue as an undisturbed form of two-way communication between two or more figures who represent polar opposites and whose interrelations are marked by high level of tension. As a result, these figures constantly refer to one another in their speech, and because of their overall equal status, they are able to interrupt each other at any time. This means that their speech are also equal in quantitative terms. Okay, and the last one about dialogical tendencies in soliloquy. The analog converse phenomenon, the presence of dialogical forms in soliloquy is always based on the fact that the identity of speakers and listeners, which defines the soliloquy, is dissolved into a contrast between speakers and address. There will be producing and a contrast between different semantic contexts. Okay, next slide, Kak. Okay, soliloquy. Soliloquy is an act of speaking one's thought aloud when by oneself or regardless of any hearers, especially by a character in a play. The first one about convention versus motivation. Soliloquy is a drama convention in which the character stands alone on the stage speaking. Originally, it was a plot device to enable character to tell the audience that what he planned to do next. For example, like a revenge. Okay. The motivated soliloquy is often interpreted by the audience as a sentence. The very fact that a figure indulged in monological speech exposes him as being unable or unwilling to communicate dialogically. This modification of the soliloquy's position in the semiotic system of drama also explain why monological speech actually seems to have been given greater significance after the banishment of the conventionalist soliloquy by the proponents of naturalist aesthetics. Okay, the second one about premeditated form versus spontaneous improvisation. The first gives the impression of dispassionate rationality and premeditated closure of content and form. The second are intended to convey the impassionate stimuli and movement of feeling, thought, and speech. It also shows, although conventionalist soliloquy general tend towards a clear disposition and motivate monologue towards disorder or the hidden order of spontaneity. This correlation sometimes appear blur or distorted, and occasionally even reversed. Okay, the third is soliloquies of action and reflection. According to this creation, we generally distinguish between soliloquies that are actional and those that are non-actional or reflective. In the former, the soliloquy constitutes in itself an act that changes the situations. In this type of soliloquy, the speaker generally feels that he or she is faced with numbers or different possibilities for action and then select one of them to follow. In this, even revocation of a decision constitutes an action. While non-actional or reflective soliloquies may be divided into two subtypes, the informative and the commentative. They can be distinguished from each other by the different ways they relate to the action. In informative soliloquy, the audience must first be informed of particular events and situations, while in commentative soliloquy, an event or situation that the audience is already familiar with is interpreted subjectively from that figure's perspective. Okay, next slide, Kak. Okay, the last one about asides. An aside is a comment that a character makes to him or herself in play. It represents their inner thoughts in spoken form. Other characters can overhear these remarks. They are meant for the audience alone. It allows the characters to break the fourth wall between the fictional world and the audience world. Okay, the first one about the monological aside, convention versus motivation. A character may also use monologue to reveal what they are thinking, but while aside and soliloquy involve the character speaking to him or herself and the audience, monologues are typically directed to other characters. It may also be directed to the audience, but it's not a speech that a character is telling him or herself. On the basis of its structural and communicative affinity with a conventional soliloquy, we should like to describe this type of aside as a conventionalist monological aside. Like the conventionalist soliloquy. The conventionalist monological aside enable the author either to present the figure's thought directly to give a commentary on particularly in the situation free of any strategic consideration, or to convey information on the intention of the figure or the background to a particular situation in an economical way. Naturally, by analogy with the motivated soliloquy, there is also a motivated monological aside, which as a short, unpremeditated, and spontaneous explanation in reaction to a particular situation remains with the naturalist bounds of plausibility. In addition to this kind of operative and spontaneous comment on the dramatic situation, a further way of motivating an aside is to present a reaction to it on the part of the dialogue partner in the form of the intercepted aside, in which the partner noticed the speaker's aside but without understanding what was said. Okay, and the second one about the aside at spectators. Like the soliloquy, the aside can also be imbued with dialogical elements if it's addressed at spectators, and in the same way that the soliloquy at spectators can break through the internal communication system and establish an explicit mediating communication system by addressing the audience. The aside at spectators is also assigned definite epic and mediatory function. The fact that this type of aside is generally found is in comedy occurs with mention affinity between comedy and epic form of information transmission. And the last one about the dialogical aside. The dialogical aside doesn't really belong in a discussion of the soliloquy or monological speech and represent a special form of dialogue. However, we would like to discuss it at this point because like the monological aside and the aside at spectators, it's based on the convention that although a speech is heard by the audience, it is not heard by certain characters on stage. The acoustic and physical implausibility of such convention can be reduced, even eliminated fairly easily by grouping for figures in a particular way on stage. All that needs to be done is to group the figures participating in the dialogical aside together at the front of the stage, well away from the other figures. Okay, thank you for listening to my explanation. The next material will be explained by my partner Pramaditya.
Okay, thank you, Adelia. I will explain about dialogical speech. In normative theories of genre, dialogue is regarded as the basic form in drama. In perspective retrospective poetics of dialogues, soliloquies and non-dialogical epic communication structures are generally regarded as mere additives that may or may not be acceptable. Thus, Hegel wrote, the complete dramatic form is the dialogue. This perspective elevation of dialogue to an idealist from norm implies a conflict-oriented theory of drama, whereby dramatic conflict is expressed in contradiction of the dialogues, which, however, only applies to one part of the historical corpus of drama text. This theory simply does not apply to modern drama, for example, and so it generally tends to disregard it. The emphasis on conflict simultaneously elevates the actional dialogue, that is, one in which each bit contains elements of action design to change the situation to the ideal norm and condemns the non-actional dialogue. That is one in which subjects are discussed regardless of whether they have any direct bearing on the action, as is the case in the playful and witty dialogues in comedy. For example, as undramatic deviations, the supra-historical and systematic aspect of our own analytical framework prevent us from making such restrictive value judgment. Moreover, the results of our differential analysis of the more quality of the contrast between soliloquy and dialogue and the monological and the dialogue that were developed in book point 4.5.1 for which such absolute and nominal ideas. Next one. Okay, quantitative relations. First, we shall turn our attention to an analysis of a quantitatively measurable relations between the various threads in a dialogue. The result of this will show that such quantitative relations are not purely surface phenomena, but they are conditioned by the semantic deep structure of the text, in turn themselves condition the deep structure. Dialogue and polylogue. This is true of the quantitative division of dialogues into duologues, or dialogues conducted by two figures, and polylogues, dialogues conducted by three or more figures. The relevance of this distinction has not been sufficiently acknowledged in previous studies of dramatic dialogue. The difference between a dialogue between two figures and one between more than two is not merely quantitative, it is also qualitative. In a polylogue, it is possible to present certain relationships that could not be conveyed in a duologue. One example is a triadic relationship between two figures arguing with each other and a mediator or commentator figure. For this reason, polylogues are potentially of more complex semantic structure than duologues. Something that is also confirmed by the fact that in the development of both Greek and medieval drama, the polylogue was preceded by the duologue. Frequency of interruption and speech length. In a quantitative analysis, it is also possible to determine the length of each individual speech or utterance, and thus the frequency which interruptions occur in the dialogue. That is the frequency of the semantic change of direction that results from a change of speaker. In Greek tragedy, this frequency could vary considerably, stretching from Cetomikia on the one hand, and which the speaker changes after each line of verse and speech as long as 110 lines, such as the messenger report in Europeids. These variations do not just occur within a single text. The average frequency of interruption may also vary according to the historical period and genre involved. Such as in comedy, for example, the average frequency tends to be higher than in tragedy. It may also vary from author to author. The average length of the longer speech in Aeschylus comes to 20 lines and in Euripides to 25 lines. And within the work of a particular author, the extremes in Sophocles come to an average of 20 lines in Oedipus the King and 29 in the Tragediae. The average frequency of interruption represents a parameter whose importance for stylistic studies of individual figures, periods, and genre has still not been fully realized. The variation in the frequency of interruption in the course of a single text is also an aspect of work that has generally received little attention from the critics. The next one. Temporal relations, succession, and simultaneity. The temporal arrangement of the various speech of utterance and dialogues normally takes the form of a succession, linear series of individual utterance and dialogues. However, this principle may be varied or broken both with a single dialogue and between a number of dialogues. The relations of utterance to another. Even when the utterance are arranged successively, there are often partial overlaps of different utterances when one figure interrupts another. This kind of interruption occurs repeatedly. This pattern, in which the speaker is interrupted by memorable, is an unbroken series through more time and creates a comic effect solely as a result of the mechanical repetition directed at a succession of different dialogue partners, at the same time as a form of verbal behavior. It also says something about the speaker, characteristic her as someone with a self-righteous will to dominate. The relationships between dialogues. As far as the temporal relationships of one dialogue to another is concerned, we can also assume that the unmarked form is a linear succession of speech of utterance. Once again, there are deviating structures of simultaneous speech which are not just restricted to modern drama. We have already drawn attention to the way what two dialogues may be presented simultaneously in the context of the aside. Example, the dialogue aside in an eavesdropping scene that enables the listener to comment on the primary dialogue or soliloquy spoken by the figure overhead. Overlapping a primary dialogue or soliloquy with a secondary dialogue or soliloquy in such a way as to provide a commentary on it is by no means restricted to eavesdropping scene. However, Temporal overlapping of two or more dialogues is a common feature of densely populated schemes, in which the polyglot is often divided into several separate conversations simply it by the way the figures are grouped together on stage. The next one, the syntagmatics of dialogue. There are three possible analytical perspectives for the syntagmatic analysis of a dialogue utterance. First one, how the individual parts of the utterance interrelate. The second, the relationships of the utterance to the previous utterance by the same figure. Third, the relationships of the utterance to the previous utterance by the other figures. How the individual parts of the utterance interrelate. The first analytical perspective, the interrelationships of the individual constituent parts of an utterance it only be discussed briefly here, since we have already analyzed the most important aspect of it in connection with soliloquy. Like a soliloquy, an individual or dialogical utterance can be coherent in its semantic orientation and the way it refers to the dramatic situation. However, it can also contain semantic change of direction and change in situational reference. This kind of utterance is thus inherently dialogical in character, insofar as its various segments can be assigned to different layers of awareness, different types of figure potential, or different roles for the speaker. In this, the semantic change of directional may exhibit the transparent tectonics of logical argument or rhetorical patterns of disposition. At the same time, they may include rational control and follow the hidden rules of association. How an utterance relates to previous utterance by the same figure. The question of the way utterance relates to previous utterance by the same figure implies the more far-reaching question of the semantic coherence and stylistic homogeneity of some total of the utterance by the one figure in both a single dialogue and the dramatic text as a whole. This question is particularly important for the verbal constitution of a particular figure, because his perspective is established in the semantic equivalence that exists between all his utterances, and also because the recurrence of certain stylistic features delineates contours of the figure's identity and distinguish him from the other figures. How well this generally function is shown by the fact that the identificatory information on the speaker in the printed text is generally redundant after the figures are introduced for the first time. That is, although it facilitates the reading process, it is not indispensable to it. This equivalence or similarities between the utterance of a single figure may be realized and emphasized by the use of verbatim repetitions, either when the figure quotes one of his previous utterance, for example, or much more widespread confession in a comedy or farce, when he reacts idiosyncratically to the most diverse events or situations by using a classified or turn of phrase. How an utterance relates to the previous utterance by the other figures. The most important of these three perspectives for the analysis of dialogue is the third, because it strives to identify the specifically dialogical quality. The question of how an utterance relates to the previous utterance by the other figures, or to be more precise, and thus facilitate analysis to the immediately preceding utterance by the dialogue partner. Hitherto, it is conceivable to establish a scale of possible relationships stretching from one extreme identity to the other, completely unrelated. We have already discussed these two extremes in connection with monolithical tendencies in dialogue. In the first case, there is absolutely no change in semantic orientation between one utterance and the other, because both partners have access to the same relevant information, and their attitudes to this information also coincide. Okay, the next one. The the rhetoric of dialogue. In our analysis of the paradigm, once you can see mention of dramatic dialogue, we can also introduce the categorization structures of rhetoric. And it is not even necessary that the text under analysis has been already produced within a rhetorical system of norms and forms, since there is an affinity of intention between rhetorical speech and the classical form of dialogical speech in drama. Both strive to use words to effect a change in the situation. However, the model of rhetorical speech cannot be applied to drama without certain reservation, as it based on specific speech situation. Namely, one-way monological communication between a single speaker and a number of listeners. Normally, this situation simply does not arise in dramatic dialogue, even though it may occasionally occur in the context of a set speech. Thus, it is understandable that rhetorical analyses have hitherto essentially been confined to analyzing this set speech in drama. This also means that the heuristic potential of rhetoric has not been yet completely established. Okay, the next one is logos ethos pathos. As the theory of effect-oriented speech, rhetoric has as its primary purpose the art of perceiving or convincing. The basic strategies developed to achieve these are convinced in such general terms that they perceive their applicability even when we move or form that they perceive their applicability even when we have moved on from a fundamental model of the public speech, and they may therefore also be used in the analysis of dialogical speech in drama. The three basic strategies result from the question whether the predominant point of reference is the speech object, logos or pragma, the speaker is ethos, or the listener pathos. This strategy is presented in content is more generally defined. The intention underlying the logo strategy is to convince by responding to the existing situation in a partisan way. Depending on the object, this response is either narrative and descriptive or argumentative. The most important techniques of partisan argumentation will be discussed in the previous section on the relationship between difference and representation by the The other strategy is based on efforts to establish the reliability and credibility of the speaker, who is then able to develop his own moral integrity or factual authority in the main argument in support of the correctness of his views. If this moral integrity and factual authority do not actually exist, they have to be fabricated by the speaker. And the last one is pastos. The pastos strategy is designed specifically to arouse strong emotions in the audience, with the intention of converting it to speaker's position. This presupposes an advanced knowledge of the physical, legal, and ideological disposition of the audience, because it is only by taking this into consideration that the speaker's pathos, whether genuine or false, can exert an effect on the audience. Among the verbal techniques used in the rhetoric or pathos are exaggerate style of metaphors and other rhetorical devices. Ability structures such as a rhetorical question, the apostrophe to listener, or the impassionate exclamation. Figurative speech. To conclude this chapter, we should like to address ourselves to a more thorough examination of one linguistic aspect that has been discussed by others in the context of historical theory has been shown of special importance of first drama in particular. We are referring to figurative or metaphoric speech. At this stage, we do not need to reproduce the sophisticated theoretical system of tropes and figures in our analysis will be confined from the outset of dealing with a small number of the forms of figurative speech, the tropes of metaphors, simulation, and so on. And in doing so, our intention is not to classify them systematically, but to investigate their function in the dramatic text. Okay, that's my explanation for this area. I think it's the last material that we explained today. So if we have a wrong word, jika ada kata-kata yang salah atau kurang berkenan, kurang lebihnya mohon maaf. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.